The picturesque holiday beaches of South Devon. Behind a wall of absolute secrecy in the spring of 1944, a series of tragic and bloody events took place. These events were to have a decisive effect on D-Day, the Allied assault on France, which would change the course of the Second World War. What happened off these beaches has been shrouded in mystery for decades. The true story has now been uncovered through newly discovered official documents and the testimony of eyewitnesses who have spoken for the first time.
I was mad for a while there because I figured a lot of guys died maybe for reasons that could have been prevented.
You could hear them screaming and hollering. It's something you'll never forget. You'll never forget.
I don't mind talking about it now. I mean, 60 years later, not much you can do about it. Can't send me to jail now.
In April 1944, over 1 million American troops, half the entire Allied invasion force, were gathered in the southwest of England. The Allied plans for the invasion of France called for the biggest amphibious operation the world had ever seen. The Americans were to take part in a series of practice invasions on the beaches of Devon. The terrible events which followed had their genesis 2 years before, 1,000 miles away from here, on the Eastern Front, in Russia. In June 1942, the Russian leader, Joseph Stalin, launched a fierce verbal attack on his British and American allies, saying their failure to open a second front revealed a fear of fighting the Germans. But opening a second front was not an easy matter. Two months later, the Allies carried out an assault on the French port of Dieppe. Its aim was to test the strength of the German fortifications. It failed completely. It was a costly mistake, both in lives and in military strategy.
The Dieppe operation was sort of a wake-up call for the Allied command and exactly how hard an amphibious operation would be. The European armies in particular tended initially to look at crossing the channel as almost like a large river crossing operation, and the real battle would be after they landed. Dieppe proved to them that the real battle is a forced entry, full-scale attack with the water at your back, that if the attack failed, there was no place to go, that it was total disaster.
In December 1942, Prime Minister Churchill and President Roosevelt met in Casablanca to discuss the opening of a second front. With the lessons of Dieppe in mind, Churchill was determined that any assault on Europe had to be meticulously executed. Within weeks, they had agreed on a plan for the invasion of France. Thanks largely to the Dieppe raid, the Germans assumed that the Pas-de-Calais was the place most likely to be attacked. Instead, the Allies would choose the beaches of Normandy, with the Americans landing on two beaches on the Cotentin Peninsula, which they codenamed Utah and Omaha. Through autumn 1943, hundreds of thousands of American troops flooded into Britain. For many of these raw conscripts, it was their first time on foreign soil.
I couldn't wait to get there, you know, and try to get into action, being a flag waver, I guess. I was glad I didn't miss it. And a lot of them had the feeling, they tell you, well, I'll never be back. I never had that feeling. I always feel nothing's going to happen to me.
Well, I was very impressed by the greeting we received when we stepped off the ship. The first thing we met was a Salvation Army worker. Handed us a donut and a cup of coffee.
Oh, I think I was about 24 years old. I just joined the Naval Medical Corps, and then we went to England in an 80-ship convoy. for service someplace we didn't know where we were going.
Their final destination was the southwest of England. The beach of Slapton Sands had been selected for the invasion exercises because of its similarity to the beaches of Normandy. It was to become one of the most secret places on Earth. The civilian population of 3,000 was given 6 weeks to leave. In all, an area of 25 square miles was evacuated to create one of the most sensitive and closely monitored military encampments ever.
There were roadblocks on all the roads, or there were wardens around. You could see something with what was going on with the activity in the bay with the ships and of course planes flying around.
We could hear gunfire at various times when the ships were shelling from the sea, but other than that we didn't really know, what was going on.
To prevent information about the secret maneuvers leaking out, the government introduced censorship of all civilian mail around the area. In March 1944, a War Cabinet memorandum revealed widespread and dangerous gossip. It claimed,
"No less than 80% of all the letters examined required excision of references to preparations for invasion."
Before the war, South Devon had been one of Britain's most popular holiday destinations. For the young US soldiers, their temporary home seemed a long way from the brutal realities of war.
I had to pinch myself. I thought I was living in a movie 300 years earlier. Everything just looked like time had stood still. It was beautiful.
I thought it was beautiful. It was fascinating to look out there and see all the green pastures that time of the year. In America, most of your fields and bigger farming areas have been taken out. You don't have the pretty fences or the green pasture that way like you would have coming in. And it was just fascinating all the way around to me.
During the first few weeks of training, the American troops were allowed out of the secured area to mix with the locals.
I had my parents send me pretzels, cookies, crackers, and things of that nature that were in short supply at the time in England. And in the evening we would go down and take that box of goodies and pass them around the pub, have a little mild and bitters and a port wine, and just enjoy ourselves.
The young GI's idyllic life would soon be transformed once the training began. By January 1944, the troops were learning the basics of amphibious assault, for this was to be the largest invasion force ever assembled, and they had only 6 months to get it right.
The purpose of it was to train those divisions and the separate units that were going to be involved in the invasion when it took place of France. We had all kinds of sections there. We had artillery, we had amphibious landing craft, and we had what I had, the amphibious training, which was to take the infantry, load them up, 30 men to a landing craft, take them out, and then bring them in for landings. And there would be a torpedo man who would carry a Bangalore torpedo. There'd be somebody with a machine gun. There'd be another one with wire cutters to get through there to facilitate the landing. It was good training for those gentlemen.
The troops were learning both how to fight and how to care for those wounded in action. Despite this, however, the US Army had not anticipated real casualties during the rehearsals. But by the final stages of training, the use of live ammunition to blood or harden the troops to battle conditions was being introduced. The American military filmed these exercises as D-Day approached. They were now becoming increasingly dangerous.
Under situations of fire, they would land in proper procedure. It didn't always go that way. Sometimes we lost some. Drownings, false landings, overhead fire. If we were going to have a landing under simulated conditions, it'd be overhead fire. Sometimes there would be a misfire of a grenade, which killed a couple of men, missed me one time, so I'm lucky. But you couldn't tell that. It was actual conditions, and it was rough, that's all. I did see the figures, but I'm sorry to say my recollection is bad, but it was in excess of 50.
Following the basic training in which over 50 soldiers had died, the exercises moved on to full-scale amphibious landings on Slapton Sands. On the 11th of March 1944, during an exercise codenamed Fox, things began to go seriously wrong.
I know someone who was in the Royal Observer Corps, and he said on one particular day there were rocket ships, they were firing rockets from rocket ships, and he knows one day there was a lot of activity on the beach, and a number of ambulances were to be seen driving along the road, which is known as the Line, between Slapton Lea and the actual Shingle Beach. But he said no one ever said how many casualties there were or whether there were deaths. He just knew that on this one particular day, ambulances were there in quite a number, really.
Royal Naval ships also accidentally shelled the beach. There's no official record of what had happened. There was no time. The Allies had a deadline to meet, and the exercise had to go on. But a young British midshipman aboard HMS Enterprise recorded the incident in his diary, which has lain closed for more than 50 years.
At about 8:15, according to my journal, we ceased fire because the landing craft was streaming towards the beach. And obviously you don't fire up until the last second. You leave a pause between ceasing fire and landing craft going ashore. I recorded in my journal that there were landing craft with rocket launchers on them, firing at the same time as we were, and that to me was very impressive. At some point after that, although it doesn't say in my journal what time was, it was reported that there were shells landing on the beach when the troops were there, and that there had been casualties. We had ceased fire before this happened, before the troops even got ashore. Who directly was involved, whether it was one of the landing craft with rockets, whether it was another ship, I don't know. We never heard.
It was not long after this event that an unusual and carefully guarded operation by American forces aroused the suspicions of a young farmer.
One morning we left Townstow to go to Totnes, and we was going along the road there towards Blackall Forces there, and in the field there on the right we saw bulldozers there. They'd have dug out great pits. On top of the earth mounds around the pits, they had boxes lined up. There could have been 50, 60 boxes there. We didn't see any bodies at that time, but there was lorries, six-wheeler lorries backed in close to the pits with canvas hoods, but what they had in the lorries, I do not know. They saw us looking at them, but they had, around the perimeter of the field, they had guards there set up every 10 paces, armed with carbines. They just waved us on, quick as they could. But there was something definitely going on that day in that field, and it was being done in secrecy. We wouldn't have known anything about it, but we were issued with a special pass to go through that area. Or else we wouldn't have known.
The spring of 1944 brought new life to the South Devon coast. It would also bring the seeds of a greater tragedy to come. April 1944, 1 month after the tragic errors of Exercise Fox, the first full-scale dress rehearsal of a practice assault on Utah Beach began. Codenamed Exercise Tiger, It would involve the carefully synchronized movement of over 30,000 men and 300 boats. The man in charge of the American naval operations was Admiral Don P. Moon, who would 6 weeks later lead the actual assault on Utah Beach. Just 1 hour before H-hour, the code name given to mark the start time on the morning of the 27th of April, there was to be a fatal mistake.
H-hour was postponed by 1 hour by Admiral Moon because all the groups weren't in the right positions at the right time. So H-hour was postponed for an hour. Now, this created some confusion. There were some engineering groups that already landed on Slapton Sands an hour before the actual postponement. So that when bombardment opened up, we got a message on the bridge that troops were already there. So Admiral Moon had me send a message to cancel the bombardment on the beach. But there was some rumors at that time that some of those troops got hit. However, that was never officially proved.
There would be no official inquiry into the incident. The exercise ploughed on. But in the vaults of the US military archives has lain a coded signal sent by a battalion commander to the 7th Corps headquarters. When the signal officer decoded the message, its terse content revealed the extent of the mistakes.
Casualties, 27 April. Simulated 50. Actual 29.
Admiral Moon later admitted his responsibility for the chaos caused by the decision to delay the exercise. He wrote,
"I made a poor decision. I learned a great deal by this delay in H-hour."
Throughout the first day of the exercise, the waves of young American soldiers were watched by the very highest-ranking Allied officers, including the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower. The real D-Day was only 6 weeks away, and he hoped to see a slick and effective assault force in action. 2 official observers watched it unfold. One of them was a British soldier attached to the American Army.
On the morning of the 27th of April, my officer said, "We have to go today we've been asked to go as an observer of an exercise being carried out on Slapton Sands." And the place seemed to be thronging with Americans, all in battle dress and what have you. Between 400 and 500 of these Americans were acting as what we call Germans. They were defending, and they were placed along the sand dunes and the cliffs there along Slapton Sand.
The other observer was Colonel Edwin Wolfe, a senior US Army training officer.
Colonel Thompson, who was then the commandant of the Assault Training Center at Woolacombe, assigned me and several of my officers for what we call Exercise Tiger, which was to be on Slapton Sands. I was to observe the landing, see how it was conducted, whether it was proper, and unfortunately, it was a mess. When I say a mess, there was overhead fire from the troops, the supposed enemy troops on shore, which was not anticipated by the landing troops coming ashore. And I regret to say there were a number of casualties.
After a while, in the distance, we saw the LSTs and small landing craft approaching. And as they came into the beach, so the doors went down. And as they started running up the beach, so these defenders started opening fire. It was obviously that they were firing in front of the advancing forces. And they started going down like ninepins. And when my officer shouted to the officer in charge, he said, "Well, that's my orders, keep firing." And he never told them to stop firing or nothing.
I was an observer. I wasn't a commanding officer of any type. I couldn't say to somebody, "Stop this" or "Stop that." What I saw was going on was I knew was wrong, and I tried to do something about it, but I had no command position.
And as we were about to go, I did a quick count, and I counted up to 150 bodies lying on the beach. Whether they were all killed, I don't know, but they looked dead to me.
I'd say I was a little sick at my stomach of what I saw, but that's the best I can say because we were under wartime conditions.
My officer was nearly sick, and he said, "Come on, let's get out of here quick." And we got out and got into our vehicle and drove back to the headquarters. And when we got back there, General Bradley was there, and my officer reported to him whatever was gone wrong. And he politely said, "Well, you have seen nothing and don't say nothing."
When I saw Colonel Thompson, all he said was, "You can't talk about it," and I didn't talk about it. I don't mind talking about it now. I mean, 60 years later, not much you can do about it. Can't send me to jail now.
As the exercise entered its second day, they began to rehearse the landing of the heavy equipment vital to D-Day's success. On the morning of the 27th of April, a convoy of 8 tank landing ships, LSTs, were being loaded. Each ship was 300 feet long, packed with nearly 600 men, and amphibious vehicles called ducks. 5 of the ships set sail from Plymouth. Off Brixham, they were joined by the remaining 3 transport ships. The complete convoy then set off on a circuit of Lyme Bay, due to end on the morning of the 28th with the landings on Slapton Sands. The whole trip would last 12 hours to replicate the sailing time to France.
When the convoy came out of Plymouth, 4 ships, then 3 of us dropped in behind them. And on the 507, we were tail end Charlie.
Which, you know, in Navy and maritime history, and that's the worst place to be. They call it Coffin Corner.
Protection for the convoy was the responsibility of the Royal Navy. For even though they were just a few miles off the Devon coast, they were now sailing into the infamous Western Channel, known as the hunting ground for German E-boats.
By 1944, the German E-boats were the fastest surface vessels afloat in the North Sea and the Channel area. They were capable of speeds of 42 to 43 knots. What was probably even more important than the ultimate high speed was the fact that they could come close to those high speeds even in relatively rough seas. Remember that they are a nighttime predator, and their departure from their bases is therefore conditioned by the coming of first genuine dark.
Across Lyme Bay, the 8 American ships lumbered on at 3.5 knots, little more than walking pace. The thousands of young GIs on board were unaware of where they were going. They did not even know if they were on an exercise or the actual invasion.
We thought we were in the middle of the war, you know, that we were on the way to France. In fact, that's what the crew was saying. Hey, you know, this is it, we're going. Nobody got on the speaker and said, men, you know, this is just an exercise.
But German intelligence did know. They were listening in to Allied radio traffic and had picked up a signal locating the convoy.
In der Nacht vom 27. zum 28. April hatten wir als Ausgangslage eine Flugzeugaufklärungsmeldung von 15:15 Uhr, die bei Start Point einen ostgehenden Geleitzug von 7 Schiffen meldete.
At 10 o'clock that night, 9 German E-boats left their base at Cherbourg and headed for the convoy. By 1:30 on the following morning, the E-boats sighted the convoy, 12 miles west of Portland Bill.
When we saw the boats, we slowed down in speed because we wanted to shoot and we couldn't fire torpedoes at 36 knots.
The convoy was stretched over 5 miles with the transport ship 507 last in line.
I think my first shooting 2 torpedoes, the torpedoes were given too much depth We were not calculating with the depth of the ships with 1 meter. And so I failed.
I heard the first torpedo went underneath us. You could hear it scrape the hull. And then the second fish hit us.
At 2 2, the 507 was torpedoed.
Boom, the torpedo hit, and it's the loudest sound that I'd ever heard. It was sort of a muffled sound, and you can hear metal crunching, and dust was falling down. And it was just a terrifying sound. It scared the living daylights out of me.
A lot of fire. Not only did we have these ducks in the tank, we had supply trucks and ammunition trucks on the deck. And right in front of the wheelhouse was an ammunition truck. And that exploded.
The boats were burning. It was not a picture you like very much. And the main thing was that we didn't know that under the cover of the deck there were the tanks full of petrol ammunition with people ready to get out for a landing or even for a real landing.
For the men on deck, the situation was desperate, but most of the troops were trapped below.
When I opened the door into the tank deck, which is the main deck that holds all of the 22 ducts that we had, it's a huge place, there was a roaring inferno in there, and the fire almost sucked me through the door. It was just like opening a blast furnace. And the Army guys were screaming and help me, and there were a lot of them that were hollering and screaming in there. And it was impossible for me to get near the door, let alone even go in because of the intense heat. It was just a solid wall of flame, and so I had to do what Navy regulations call for, and that's back out, close the door, and close all the hatches to preserve watertight integrity. They couldn't get out, I couldn't get in, so it was a bad situation. Nightmares for years.
15 minutes later, the E-boats closed in on another transport ship, the 531.
Bang! There was just a big ball of flame in the center of that ship. As I was going up that ramp to get up to the top deck, there was Navy man there, how many more, holding the hatch. I said, I don't know. I couldn't give him an answer. And when I hit the top deck, bang, you hit the second time. I got thrown over the side, about 53 feet to the water. That's quite a bit of distance to hit that water. And then when I come back up, I was going down, and I come back up and I could see another ship to my right, just like a red hot dog on top of the water. Everything was flame. And from the light of the flames, I could see the bow of our ship sticking up out of the water.
The transport ship sank in less than 10 minutes, taking over 400 men with her. For many of the survivors, their lack of even the most basic training would prove fatal.
Well, I saw Army guys, full pack, helmets on. I saw one guy jump over, and as he hit the water and the water got under the helmet, just snapped his neck right back, and he was dead right there. But the Army, they had these belts, and they had CO2 tubes in them, and you turned it and it punctured a hole in them, and it blew it out. Well, what happened, they were never told how to use them, so they thought you just put it around your waist. They were never told to pull them up here. And what happened was then when they inflated, they couldn't move them, so it pushed them backwards. Some of them had packs, some of them had their rifles and their helmets, and they were just top heavy. So most of them went over backwards. There were very few of them face forward, mostly backwards.
Several of the officers ran around where they could, telling them people, get off, abandon ship. And of course, we're in the back with no way to go but over the side into the water. And it was cold.
It was like bathing in ice water, of solid ice cubes. Very cold.
I could see bodies floating around. I could hear men screaming and holler, but I was alone. And I'll tell you, when I went off that ship, going down, like an old saying I told people, did you ever see your whole life go by your eyes? You live. It's getting to me now. Your whole life goes in front of your eyes. You just live your whole life over again. It's frustrating.
I do remember turning around and watching my ship go down, because there was this big light and big explosion and this big noise, and I remember saluting the ship, and down it went.
The ship sank with a cost of over 200 lives. Several hundred more were fighting for survival in the freezing sea.
And me in the water, hearing them hollering and yelling, and I couldn't do a thing for anybody but myself. And I did say some words. I prayed to the guy upstairs, and I said, I'm too young to die.
Many of the men were left in the water for nearly 4 hours before being rescued. While the remaining ships in the convoy scattered, a third ship, which had survived a torpedo hit in the stern, had remarkably managed to limp back to Dartmouth Harbour.
When I got to Dartmouth, I seen one of the LSTs whose stern was all blown apart. Then we knew we had had some problems. And we seen all the damage, and we seen our fellas, some of our welders up there working on it, cutting bulkheads open to remove the bodies.
By morning, the cost could be counted. Not a single E-boat had been sunk. 2 of the precious transport ships had been destroyed, and 1 seriously damaged. Of the 3,500 men who had embarked on the convoy, 749 had lost their lives, and over 300 were wounded. But how could the E-boats have attacked unchallenged? Why had the British Royal Navy, who was supposed to protect the convoy, allowed their American allies to become sitting targets? What had set out as a training exercise had become all too real. Within 40 minutes, in an area known to be dangerous, nearly 800 defenseless men had been killed by E-boats. The protection of these waters fell to the Royal Navy Command Centre at Plymouth. It had a long record of failure in counteracting E-boat activity. A failure to give adequate warning of attack or to provide sufficient warships to escort convoys. The sternest of all critics was Plymouth's own commanding officer, Admiral Sir Charles Forbes.
Admiral Forbes, who had been the Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet, complained that the staff officers allocated to him, many of them were elderly reservists, passed over officers, and because Plymouth had become something of a backwater, well away from the Battle of the Atlantic, that nobody had really stressed the staff, let's put it that way. And so when they did get a crisis, they didn't really react properly.
Admiral Forbes had warned the Admiralty about his staff's shortcomings 2 years before Exercise Tiger. He wrote,
"They are mostly retired officers, untrained as staff officers, who know little of the art of naval warfare and appear slow to learn. I cannot myself spend 24 hours a day in the operations room."
4 months before Exercise Tiger, Rear Admiral Ralph Latham took over from Admiral Forbes. He inherited some of his predecessor's staff problems and the unaddressed threat of the E-boats. Within weeks of Admiral Latham taking over, E-boats attacked a convoy and sank 4 ships at a cost of 72 lives. The convoy had not been warned of the impending attack. A naval inquiry placed the blame firmly on Plymouth Command and warned that failure to make changes
might lead to a much greater disaster.
Less than 2 months later, Exercise Tiger began. Ignoring all the usual practices of convoy support, Tiger's convoy had been allowed to sail with only 2 escorts, a lightly armed corvette and an elderly destroyer, HMS Scimitar. But just a few hours before the convoy set off, Scimitar was involved in a collision at sea and returned to Plymouth Dockyard.
The destroyer allocated to escort the Tiger convoy was HMS Scimitar. It was a veteran of 1918, and one minor accident which really didn't seem very significant at the time, but the fact that it didn't seem to attract any attention, it should have led to a cancellation of the exercise or a delay.
This knowledge was not repeated to Admiral Moon. He had no idea that one of the escorts had been removed. The escorts, of course, in the English Channel were under command of the British, and they escorted all the traffic in the English Channel.
It was to take more than 12 hours for the duty officer at Plymouth Command to realize that something was amiss. The convoy had sailed with only 1 escort. At this stage, the complete convoy was only just joining up off Brixham. Yet it was still allowed to continue. Worse still, the lightly armed corvette, HMS Azalea, had not been informed that she was the sole escort at the head of the 5-mile-long convoy. A final blunder made a disaster unstoppable. A typographical error in the sailing plans meant that all 8 American ships were on a different radio frequency to their escort. They had no contact with HMS Azalea, whose captain, Lieutenant Commander George Geddes, and the American convoy commander should have liaised to check on the radio frequency to be used. They never met.
The British corvette and the commanding officer of the LST flotilla had mixed up the communication circuits and didn't have the correct circuit to communicate with each other, and somehow one of the others got the wrong circuit number.
Unable to communicate with the convoy, the Azalea, designed as an anti-submarine vessel, was no match for the agile E-boats. It did not fire a single shot during the whole battle. In a subsequent inquiry, her captain, Lieutenant Commander Geddes, was criticized for lack of initiative. Oblivious to its utter vulnerability, totally defenseless, and without even the ability to call for help, the convoy of 8 ships, packed with 3,500 men, stood no chance.
You take one chance too many, and the result is a tragedy. Each mistake by itself may not have been sufficient to result in those deaths, but the cumulative effect could only have one outcome.
As the scale of the disaster emerged, one thing became clear. It had to be hidden from the Germans. So was born one of the best-kept secrets of the Second World War.
The Tiger disaster was kept secret, as all military operations are kept secret, in the sense that you never tell the enemy publicly what damage he has done to you. The second thing in Tiger's case was more than just giving the enemy a casualty count or a ship count that they were successful. It also tipped them off to the importance of the area we were using. From locating the area we were using and stressing that there must be a reason we're using it, they probably could have done beach studies and assessed pretty much where we were going to land in France.
With a disaster on this scale, the problem facing the authorities was how to keep it secret, especially as some of the locals were beginning to hear of the tragedy.
Father and John were at B-Sands delivery meet, and there were a lot of Americans there going up and down the shore, and they were asking the fishermen who'd been out to see if they'd seen any bodies or anything like that. So that we gleaned a bit of information there, and we realised that something had gone tragically wrong somewhere.
In the days that followed, the sea began to give up its dead. With every tide came more bodies. Special units had the grim task of combing the beaches.
Most of them were picked up in the Weymouth area. And the transportation truck companies and the service company that was attached to us would load the trucks with the deceased and transport them to us at Brookwood.
Brookwood in Surrey was a World War I military cemetery. Swiftly and secretly, the bodies were prepared for burial.
Well, they were arriving by truck. There was a service company and a transportation truck company, which I don't remember the numbers, but they would bring them to the cemetery. We would unload them, and at the morgue, we would place them in the morgue for the British morticians, which were under contract to the U.S. Army, for them to embalm them. 262 in one night, and we worked on them for 4 days. You know, those I saw, as I remember it, looked like they had just gone to sleep in their clothing, but they were wet, of course. It appears that there was a great bit of drowning. It was our policy that we handle them with reverence and respect, and we did that as much as we could. And after processing, getting the personal effects to send to the next of kin, and to get them into some fresher clothes, they were taken to the cemetery gravesite, where we had chaplains available to conduct the service. It was a full military service. Not too elaborate, but enough to dignify the occasion.
Disposing of the dead bodies had been a problem, but even more serious was how to stop the story getting out from the 300 wounded men.
The colonel, about 11 o'clock in the morning, said, in about half an hour, we're going to see blast injuries and immersion shock. Take no histories. Don't talk to them. Don't converse with them. Just treat them as veterinary patients. There were about 400 or 500. Mostly hypothermia, but some blast injuries and some machine gun wounds. A cordon of military police was around the hospital. It was impossible to enter or leave the premises for 3 days. The colonel said, anybody that mentioned this fiasco would be subject to court-martial.
The commanding officer of the 7th Corps, Major General Lawton Collins, issued an order to all personnel involved in the exercise.
We were told not to talk to anybody about exercise. I didn't even know what it was called at that time. You weren't to talk to anybody about it. And I was laying in the hospital, my leg all wrapped up, and they come in, a little, what do you call it, an orderly, with a little book, and said, John Perry, write a few notes to your parents that everything's all right and you're okay. We weren't allowed to say another word.
Some officer told us if we did, they'd prosecute us. Said that if talked about it, they'd have us in prison for it. Of course, at our age then, we didn't know whether to talk back or not to, and we wasn't supposed to anyhow. So everybody just kept quiet.
One problem still remained: what to tell the families of the men who had died. It was standard practice to send relatives a personal letter from the commanding officer explaining how their loved ones had perished. In the case of Exercise Tiger, however, families were merely informed they were missing in action.
I remember a telegram came to the farmhouse, and I remember Mother just crying and just screaming, you know, and it was real sad. And I remember her going out behind the shed, crying she didn't want to live anymore. That made quite an impact on me, you know, because I was like, you know, I need you, Mom. You know, I don't want you to die.
For the Allies, however, there was no time to dwell on the disaster. D-Day was now less than 6 weeks away. But the consequences of losing 2 tank landing ships, LSTs, with a third badly damaged, proved very serious.
The loss of the LSTs put more strain on the organisation than the actual loss of the soldiers. That is not said callously. It is just a fact that there were lots and lots and lots of GIs, and every one of those deaths is to be regretted. But the actual strain of the D-Day operation ultimately boiled down to numbers of landing ships.
D-Day had already been postponed by 1 month, so more vital LSTs could be built. Churchill once said, "The destinies of 2 great empires seem to be tied up in some goddamned things called LSTs."
The invasion was so tightly planned, and planned with not enough resources as it was, that the loss of a mere 3 LSTs became a matter of discussion at the Prime Minister and President level, because it was going to change the landing schedule for one of the major units.
General Eisenhower left the exercise before the E-boat attack. What he had seen up to that point depressed him. The debacle on Slapton Sands highlighted the task ahead. He later alluded to Exercise Tiger in one paragraph of his personal history of the Normandy landings.
There was an unfortunate loss of life in the sinking of 2 LSTs. In other respects, however, the exercises were successful and valuable lessons were learned.
D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. The lessons of Exercise Tiger were put into practice. The Normandy landings were a success as the Americans took both Omaha and Utah beaches. Whilst they suffered great losses on Omaha, the cost of taking Utah was just 197 men, 1/4 of those lost during Exercise Tiger. 3 months later, aboard his flagship, the USS Bayfield, Admiral Moon, who had been in charge of Exercise Tiger, committed suicide.
The only thing we can really conject from this is that the stress of responsibility was just too great for him and he couldn't go on. Admiral Moon's body was removed at night from the Bayfield and was buried in a small cemetery in Naples, Italy, in an unmarked grave at the time. Then later on, his body was disinterred and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C.
But many of the relatives of those who died on Exercise Tiger had no graves at which to grieve. For decades, they were not told what had happened. They could never come to terms with their loss, as many clung desperately to the belief their loved ones were still alive. Some died, never knowing.
She wanted to believe, too, that just that little bit of hope that kept her going, that maybe he was still alive. She used to say that someday I'm going to look out this window, meaning in her front room, and I'm going to see Oliver walking home, coming down that lane someday, thinking that maybe he was a prisoner of war, and that they might release him someday and he'd come walking home.
Find out more about the 60th anniversary of D-Day at channel4.com/history. Well, next up, Tony Robinson's digging up trenches on the north coast of Normandy to find evidence of D-Day in a Time Team special.